"Not you, Gun. Her grace says that face will spoil the soup." The words rang across the stable yard of Lockwood Hall like a slap. Every groom froze. A stable boy dropped a bucket. Water splashed across the cobbles, and nobody moved to wipe it up. Elias Gunn did not look up from the bay mare's foreleg. He kept running his thumb along the tendon, checking for heat, checking for swelling, the way he had checked 100 times before. His hands did not shake, his face did. Just once, a small tightening at the jaw, gone as fast as it came. Up at the great house, bunting snapped in the autumn wind. Brass instruments tuned themselves in the ballroom. Silver was being counted twice. Lockwood Hall was 2 days from the county's grandest night in a generation. A victory feast for General Sir Augustus Blythe, hero of Spion Kop, home at last from 7 years of service and silence. The hall would be full of men in medals, men who had ordered charges from safe hills, men who had signed dispatches in dry tents while other men burned. Not one of them had climbed out of the fire itself, except the man kneeling in the stable yard, holding a horse's leg, wearing a coachman's coat with a burn scar that ran from his left ear down under his collar like a brand. Lieutenant Giles Lockwood, 24 years old, parade perfect in his dress uniform, leaned against the stable door with his arms crossed and a grin spreading over his smooth, unscarred face. "Did you hear him, Gun?" Giles said. "Her Grace has spoken. That face of yours is banned from the feast. Banned from the whole house, in fact, until further notice." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a stub of boot black, and with 2 fingers dragged a thick smear down his own cheek, ear to collar, copying the scar line for line. The grooms did not laugh, not one of them. Giles laughed enough for all of them. "There," he said, turning his blackened cheek toward the stable boys. "Now which of us frightens the soup?" Elias stood. He was not a tall man, but something in the way he rose made the yard go quieter. He looked at Giles for exactly 1 second. Then he turned back to the mare, pressed his palm flat against her chest, and breathed long, slow, even, until the horse's ears came forward and her weight settled evenly on all 4 legs. He said nothing. The mare leaned her head against him, the way horses had leaned against him since he was 14 years old, as if his stillness were the only safe place in the yard. Nobody in that stable yard knew what those breaths had once bought. Nobody knew that the same slow breathing had once walked a man through burning grass at Spion Kop, not once, not twice, but 3 times, carrying weight that should have killed him on the second trip alone. Nobody knew that the guest of honor arriving in 2 days owed his very heartbeat to the man they had just banned from serving him soup. Nobody knew. But before the week was out, every person at Lockwood Hall would know exactly whose life had once been carried out of that fire, and by whose arms. But before we continue, subscribe now, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and what time you saw this video. Tonight's story is one you will never forget. Lockwood Hall stood at the edge of the Derbyshire moors, 400 years of grey stone, with a name that still meant something at county dinners, if less at county banks. Duke Ferdinand Lockwood had inherited the title, the debts, and a wife who intended to spend the family back into relevance 1 guest list at a time. Duchess Eulalie Lockwood ran that household the way a general ran a campaign. Every servant assigned a rank, and that rank was not based on loyalty or skill or years of service. It was based on how a person looked standing in a doorway. She called it presentation. The staff called it, quietly, among themselves, the ranking. Twice a year, Eulalie lined every servant in the front hall for inspection. Housemaids first, footmen second, then grooms, then kitchen staff, arranged not by duty but by countenance. Her word, said with the flat confidence of a woman who had never once been told no. The autumn inspection fell 3 days before the feast, and Eulalie walked the line slowly, a small silver-handled cane tapping the flagstones as she went, pausing before each servant as though appraising livestock at a fair. "Turn," she said to the first housemaid, and the girl turned. "Good bones." Front hall, I think, where the guests will see you first." She moved on. "You to a footman with a strong jaw and dull eyes. The ballroom entrance. Stand very straight and say nothing." She reached the groom's last, always last, and found Elias at the end of the row where he stood every year. She did not ask him to turn. "Not that one," she said to her housekeeper, without lowering her voice, as though he were a piece of furniture too large to move discreetly. "We do not pay wages to frighten guests." "Yes, your grace." The housekeeper murmured, and made a small mark in her ledger, and the inspection moved on to the kitchen staff as though nothing at all had happened, because in Eulalie's arithmetic, nothing had. Duke Ferdinand agreed, as he agreed with everything that cost him nothing. He had wandered into the hall midway through the inspection, newspapers still folded under one arm, and caught only the housekeeper's murmured agreement. "Quite right, my dear," he said, not troubling to ask what he was agreeing to. "Best he keep to the stables." He said it without looking up from his newspaper. He had perfected the art of never looking up from anything that might require a decision, and he wandered back out of the hall a moment later, having spent perhaps 4 seconds of his attention on a man's entire livelihood. So for 6 years Elias had lived at the edge of the estate, in a room above the tack shed, tending horses that never once asked him what he looked like. He drove the family carriage when required, always at night, always with his collar turned up, always seated, so that the passengers behind him saw nothing but the back of his head. It suited him. He had not come to Lockwood Hall to be seen. He had come to disappear. The scar ran from just below his left ear, across the hinge of his jaw, down the side of his neck, and vanished under his collar toward his shoulder. Burn scars do that. They do not stop where the story stops. They keep going, under the clothes, into places the eye is never shown. 6 years, and no one at Lockwood Hall had ever asked him how he got it. That was about to change. Because General Sir Augustus Blythe was coming home, and General Sir Augustus Blythe had one condition attached to his acceptance of the invitation. A condition his aide had already sent by letter, sealed with the regimental crest, a letter that was at this very moment sitting unopened on the Duchess's writing desk. The general wished to meet every member of staff at Lockwood Hall, down to the stables. Giles Lockwood had never fired a shot in anger in his life. He had trained, drilled, marched, and postured his way to a lieutenant's commission through a combination of his father's connections and his mother's ambition, and he wore his dress uniform the way other young men wore a new coat. Proud of the cut, blind to what it was meant to represent, he found Elias endlessly entertaining, a scarred stable hand who never spoke above a murmur, never defended himself, never so much as raised his voice. Giles read that silence as weakness, the way certain men always mistake restraint for surrender. The mockery did not end with the boot-black. It became a small ritual, repeated whenever Giles had friends to entertain and nothing better to occupy them. "Come, Gun," he said the next morning, strolling into the stable block with 2 of his friends from the yeomanry, boys as smooth-faced and unbloodied as himself. "Kitchen fire, was it? Or did some public house brawl get the better of you? The grooms have a wager running. I've put a shilling on drink." Elias kept currying the gray gelding in long, even strokes. "An accident, sir," he said. It was the same answer he always gave, 2 words and nothing more. The lie sat in the air like smoke, because it was not quite a lie and not quite the truth, and the men who heard it never once suspected that the modesty inside it burned hotter than any confession could have. Giles's friends laughed. One of them, a red-faced boy named Pemberton, made a sound like an explosion and clutched his own face in mock agony, and the others laughed harder. "Perhaps it was a woman," Pemberton offered, wiping his eyes. "Scorned wife with a hot poker. That would explain the silence, wouldn't it? A man doesn't brag about a beating from a jealous husband." "Or a candle knocked into a hayloft," said the second friend, a lanky boy called Vane. Drunk enough not to notice he was on fire until the smell reached him. Each guest landed and passed, And Elias answered none of them beyond his 2 words, and the horse under his hand shifted, uneasy at the noise. And Elias placed his palm flat against its neck and breathed, and the horse went still, and something about that stillness made even Pemberton's laughter falter for half a second before it started up again. "He does that with the horses," Giles said, watching. "Breathes at them. Half the grooms think he's touched in the head." "An accident, sir," Elias said again, and went back to his work and did not look up until they were gone. That evening, in the servants' hall, over bread and cold mutton, the head groom, an older man named Purdy, who had worked the Lockwood stables for 30 years and had long since stopped expecting fairness from the house above, leaned across the table toward Elias. "You could tell them," Purdy said low. "Shut the lieutenant's mouth in 1 sentence if you chose." "Could?" Elias agreed and said nothing further, and Purdy, who had asked the same question in different words for 6 years and never once gotten more than that single syllable, let it drop, as he always did. The letter from General Blythe's aide sat on Eulalie's writing desk for 3 days before she finally opened it, because she had assumed, as she assumed most things concerning the household staff, that it required no urgency. She read the guest list first. Lords. Colonels. The county's finest, arranged exactly as she liked her world arranged, by rank and polish. She smiled over the names the way another woman might smile over a string of pearls. Then she reached the second paragraph, and her smile did not survive it. The general, wrote the aide in careful copperplate, wished it understood as a condition of his attendance that he would take the opportunity, before or after the feast, to greet every member of the household staff personally, including, the letter specified, those in the stables and grounds. The general had, the aide noted, a particular fondness for meeting the men who kept the horses of any house he visited. He considered it, the letter said, a matter of some personal importance, and had made the same request at every house he had visited these 7 years past. Eulalie read that sentence 3 times. Then she called for her housekeeper and instructed that the guided tour of the grounds, previously scheduled to include the stable yard, be shortened. "For time," she said. "The general's schedule is very full. We cannot have him standing about in a stable yard when there is a feast waiting. Strike it from the itinerary. If he asks, tell him the horses were unwell and the yard closed for the day." She did not ask why a decorated general wished to meet stable hands. It did not occur to her to wonder. In her arithmetic, servants were furniture, and furniture did not have histories worth uncovering. She had, without knowing it, just scheduled the most dangerous man at Lockwood Hall out of the one meeting that could have ended everything quietly, privately, with dignity intact. It would not end quietly. It would not end privately. And by the time it ended, dignity would be the last thing left standing in that ballroom, and it would not be hers. 2 days before the feast, a small procession of tradesmen's carts began arriving at Lockwood Hall from dawn until dusk. Crates of hothouse flowers, barrels of oysters packed in ice, cases of French wine the Duke could not entirely afford, a brass band's worth of instrument cases, and, trailing behind the last cart, a note from the county newspaper confirming that a correspondent and a photographer would attend to cover the county's tribute to its returning hero. Eulalie read that note twice with visible satisfaction. A photographer meant the evening would be remembered in print, in exactly the arrangement she intended, and she spent an hour rearranging the seating chart so that her own chair sat in clear view of wherever the photographer was likely to stand. She did not spend 1 minute wondering where the coachman would be standing, because in her mind he would not be standing anywhere the guests could see. 4 days before the feast, the village held its harvest fete on the green below Lockwood Hall, an event the Duke attended every year because it cost him almost nothing and returned him a great deal of goodwill among tenant farmers who still technically owed him rent. Eulalie insisted the family carriage lead the small procession down from the hall. The 4 grays paired with the older bays for the occasion, ribbons braided into their manes, the Lockwood crest polished on the carriage doors until it threw back the afternoon sun. Half the county turned out along the lane to watch the gentry arrive. Farmers and shopkeepers and their families lined 3 deep in places, children perched on fence rails for a better view. Elias drove. It was, in fact, the one public duty Eulalie had never managed to strip from him, because no other hand on the estate could be trusted with a green team and a watching crowd. And even the Duchess understood, in her way, that a bolting carriage in front of the whole county would embarrass her a great deal more than a scarred coachman on the box. She solved the problem instead by seating him as far forward and as hunched as the box allowed, collar up, hat brim low, so that from the green below he was little more than a dark shape holding the reins. It did not stay that way. Halfway down the lane, a hedge sparrow burst up from the verge directly under the lead horse's nose, and the near side gray shied hard, nearly tangling its legs with its yokemate, and for one heart-stopping second the whole carriage rocked sideways on the ruts. Elias had it settled again in 4 seconds, his hat gone, his collar caught by the wind and pulled loose, and by the time the horses stood quiet, the entire crowd along the lane had gotten a clear look at the man on the box, hatless, exposed, the scar catching the afternoon light plainly for the first time in front of half the county. A murmur went through the onlookers, the particular murmur of people who have just seen something they were not meant to see. A few farm wives crossed themselves. A boy on a fence rail pointed before his mother pulled his hand down. Giles, riding alongside on his own hunter to be seen doing so, laughed loudly enough that the sound carried over the crowd. "There he is," he called out, to nobody and everybody, grinning at the nearest cluster of tenant families. "Our very own fairground fright. Frightens the crows off the corn better than any scarecrow papa's ever bought." A ripple of uncertain laughter went through a few of the onlookers, the kind of laughter that comes from people who are not sure whether laughing is expected of them. And Elias, still holding the reins steady with both hands, said nothing at all and kept his eyes on the road ahead, and did not so much as glance at the crowd that was staring at him. Eulalie, riding inside the carriage with the windows down for the fete, heard every word of it, and instead of silencing her son, she leaned toward the window and called up sharp and carrying, "Gun your hat. Do try to look respectable, we are nearly at the green." It was, in its way, worse than Giles's taunt. Giles mocked him as sport. Eulalie corrected him as though a scarred face were a stain on a tablecloth that simply needed straightening before company. At the green itself, the fete unfolded exactly as it did every year: stalls of preserves and pressed cider, a brass band rather smaller and rather worse than the one hired for the feast, a greased pole, a tug-of-war between the estate's grooms and the village blacksmiths, that the grooms lost by a wide and cheerful margin. The Duke gave his customary short speech about the harvest and the county's good fortune, and the crowd applauded politely, and the whole event might have passed the way it always did. Except that this year, for the first time, half the tenant farmers on that green had seen the coachman's face plainly in daylight, and by the time the last cart rattled home at dusk, the story of the scarred man on the Lockwood box had traveled from the green to every farmhouse kitchen in 3 parishes, in a dozen different shapes, none of them the true one, because nobody at Lockwood Hall had ever once told anybody what that scar actually meant. Purdy heard 3 different versions of it repeated back to him at the public house that same night: a fire at a mill, a fight over a woman, a curse from a gypsy camp the family had once turned away at the gate. And he said nothing to correct any of them, because he did not know the truth himself, only that Elias never spoke of it, and that the not speaking had always struck Purdy as the loudest thing about the man. Word of the fete reached the stable yard the next morning in the form of 2 farm boys who had walked up from the village specifically to gawk at the coachman through the yard gate, whispering to each other and pointing, until Purdy chased them off with a bucket of water they were lucky not to catch across their heads. Elias said nothing about any of it. He fed the horses. He checked the lame mare's leg, healing well now under a week of rest. He worked the new grays in slow circles in the yard, murmuring to them, breathing with them exactly as he always had, as though half the county had not spent an entire evening turning his face into a fireside story. But something in him had gone a little quieter than usual, and Purdy, watching from the tack room door, thought, not for the first time, that a man could only be laughed at so many times before something underneath him wore thin, the way a good leather strap wears thin at the same fold, invisible until the day it finally gives. The night before the feast, Giles Lockwood had too much brandy and an audience of friends to impress. The new four-in-hand had arrived that week, 4 matched grays, barely broken to harness, meant to pull the family carriage in a grand procession for the general's arrival the following afternoon. Elias had been working with them for 11 days, walking them, driving them in slow circles in the yard, gentling them 1 inch of trust at a time. They were not ready. He had said so twice, to the head groom, who had said so once to the Duke, who had not listened. They startle at brass, Elias told Purdy that afternoon, checking the near leader's girth for the 3rd time. The band tomorrow will set them dancing if we're not careful. Another fortnight and they'd be steady. Not yet. Tell the Duke that, Purdy said, and see how far it gets you. That evening, with the band's instruments being tested in the ballroom above and the sound of brass drifting faintly out across the yard, Giles and his 2 friends stumbled out to the stable block, brandy loud in Giles's voice, looking for one more amusement before the night ended. "Watch this," Giles said to Pemberton in vain, swinging up onto the driver's box before anyone could stop him. "Let's see what Papa's expensive new horses can do." He snapped the reins hard. The grays, unused to his hands, unused to his voice, unused to anything but Elias's slow, careful pressure, bolted. The carriage lurched across the yard, wheels screaming against the cobbles, harness jangling in a panic of brass buckles and flying leather. A stable boy, 15 years old, name of Tam, who had been crossing with a bucket of feed, froze directly in the horse's path, and for 1 full second it looked as though 4 half-ton animals moving at a dead run were about to crush him against the stable wall. Somewhere above, a woman's voice cried out from an open window, and a glass shattered on a sill, and the whole yard seemed to hold its breath at once. Elias was already moving before the horses reached full speed. He did not run at them. He walked, fast but even, straight into the center of the panic, the way he had once walked into fire while other men ran the other direction. He put his body between the boy and the horses. He raised both hands, palms open, and he breathed. The same long, slow, impossible breathing he used on every frightened animal he had ever touched, and he spoke to the lead horse in a voice so low that Giles's friends, watching from the steps, could not make out a single word. The lead horse's stride broke. The second horse followed. The carriage shuddered to a stop 4 feet from the stable wall, close enough that Tam felt the heat of the horse's breath on his face, and not 1 inch closer. Silence fell over the yard. Pemberton's brandy glass hung forgotten in his hand. Somewhere a dog barked twice and went quiet, as if even the animals understood something enormous had just happened and passed. Giles climbed down from the box, white-faced, shaking, and for 1 moment, 1 single moment, something almost like gratitude crossed his features. It did not last. By morning, sober and humiliated in front of the friends whose respect he prized above almost everything, Giles told a different story. He told his father that the coachman had panicked the team himself, reaching for the reins without authority, that Gunn's clumsy hands were responsible for nearly killing a stable boy, that the man was a liability who ought to have been dismissed years ago for his nerves alone. The Duke, who wanted only to avoid an unpleasant conversation on feast morning, nodded along and said he would look into it after the general had come and gone. That single small win belonged to no one yet, but it was coming. Because Tam, the stable boy who owed his life to two open hands and a low voice, had seen exactly what happened. And Tam was not the kind of boy who forgot a debt. Here is what nobody at Lockwood Hall knew, and what the viewer alone is about to learn. 7 years earlier, on a hillside in South Africa called Spion Kop, the grass had caught fire beneath a ridge held by soldiers who had nowhere left to retreat. Smoke rolled black across the slope, thick enough to swallow a man whole 3 steps in. Shells fell in the dark beyond the flame line, close enough that the ground jumped under running feet. Men screamed for stretcher bearers who could not reach them through the flame and the falling shells, and their screaming thinned, in places, into a silence far worse than any scream. A sergeant of no particular rank, no particular family, and no particular fame walked into that fire. He walked in once, and came out carrying a corporal with a shattered leg, the man's boot dragging a black furrow through the ash. He walked in a second time, and came out carrying a private half-blind from the smoke, coughing blood onto the sergeant's own collar, the burn already blistering along his neck, though he did not stop to feel it yet. He walked in a third time, and every man on that hillside who watched him go swore afterward that no one should have survived a third trip into flame that thick, that no man's lungs could take it, that they had already begun composing what they would say at his funeral. Somewhere behind the flame line, a man's watch had stopped, melted at the strap, and later that watch would be the only thing recovered of him at all. He came out the third time carrying a young colonel across his shoulders, the colonel's uniform smoking at the collar, his voice cracked to nothing from the smoke, whispering the same 4 words over and over, as the sergeant staggered the last 100 yards to the medical line, his own boots leaving scorched prints in the mud. "Your name, Sergeant, your name." The sergeant set him down as gently as a man setting down glass. He looked at the colonel's face, young, ash-streaked, alive only because of an arithmetic that should not have worked, and he said nothing at all. He turned and walked back toward the smoke to see if there was one more man left to find, and by the time anyone thought to ask his name again, he had gone. A medal was gazetted for that day. Correspondents wrote of an unnamed sergeant of extraordinary gallantry. The regiment searched its rolls. Men who had served beside him swore they knew his face, but had never once heard his surname spoken above a whisper before that afternoon. And in the chaos and transfers and casualty lists that followed, the name attached to the citation was recorded, misfield, and eventually lost in an army too large and too bloodied to chase down one modest man who did not want finding. The young colonel survived to become a general. He had spent every year since asking after a face he had only seen once, lit orange by burning grass, close enough to feel its breath, close enough to know he would recognize it anywhere on earth, in any light, for the rest of his life. He had asked at every posting, every regimental dinner, every hospital ward that had once treated burn cases from that campaign. He had carried a small, worn case with him from posting to posting 7 years, never once left behind, never once opened in front of strangers. He had never stopped looking. He had never stopped owing. And the reason the sergeant never claimed his medal, never gave his name, never let himself be found, had nothing to do with modesty and everything to do with grief. Because for every man Elias Gunn carried out of that fire, there had been others he could not reach. Men whose voices he still heard some nights. Men whose faces the burning grass had taken before his hands ever got there. He had done the arithmetic 1,000 times since, in the dark, in the tack room, in the quiet hours before dawn, and it never came out even. 4 men saved did not balance against the ones he had failed to save. He did not believe he deserved a medal for men he had lost as much as men he had carried. So he had come home, changed his bearing, taken a coachman's post in a quiet county, and let the world believe the scar on his neck was nothing more than an accident. It was easier than being thanked for a debt he did not think he had paid. He did not know the colonel he carried that day now wore a general's stars. He did not know that General was arriving at Lockwood Hall in 2 days' time. He did not know the Duchess had just struck the one meeting that would have found him quietly from the schedule, and that fate, having waited 7 years, was not about to be denied twice. The morning before the feast, General Bligh's aide, a quiet, observant captain named Whitfield, who noticed everything his general noticed and said less of it, rose early and took a walk around the grounds while the household still slept. He passed the stable yard and saw a man kneeling beside a lame mare, one hand resting on her fetlock, murmuring something too low to hear, and the mare, who had been favoring that leg for 3 days and flinching from every groom who touched it, stood perfectly still under his palm. Captain Whitfield had spent 30 years around cavalrymen and knew the genuine article when he saw it. He watched for a full minute before he spoke. "That's a nasty strain," he said, stepping closer. "You've a light hand with her." "She'll mend, sir," Elias said, not looking up. "Give her a week off the cobbles." Whitfield glanced, briefly, at the man's collar, at the edge of scarred skin visible above it, and something in his soldier's memory stirred without yet naming itself. "What's your name?" he asked. The man looked up. For just a moment, something crossed his scarred face, not fear, exactly, but the wariness of a man who has spent years hoping not to be asked exactly that question by exactly this kind of man. "Gunn, sir. Elias Gunn." Whitfield wrote it in a small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, the way he wrote down every name worth remembering, and said nothing further, and walked on toward the house. Though he found himself glancing back once, over his shoulder, at the scarred man still kneeling by the mare. He did not yet know why the name mattered. He only knew, the way certain old soldiers simply know things, that it would. That same morning, in the front hall, the truth about the runaway carriage came apart in front of the Duke. Giles was midway through his account. Polished now, rehearsed, the coachman's incompetence painted in broader strokes than the night before. When young Tam, summoned to confirm a detail nobody expected him to contradict, spoke up in a small, clear voice that carried further than he intended. "Beg pardon, sir, but that's not how it was. Mr. Gunn didn't touch those reins at all. Lieutenant Giles was driving. It was Mr. Gunn as stopped them, walking right up to the horses' heads, and if he hadn't, I'd not be standing here to say so. The hall went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when a lie has just lost its footing in front of witnesses." The Duke looked at his son. Giles's face went through 3 colors in rapid succession: white, then red, then a blotchy, furious purple. "The boy is confused," Giles said. "He was frightened. Anyone would misremember a fright like that." "I'm not confused, sir," Tam said, quieter now, but not backing down. "I felt their breath on my face. I know whose hands stopped them." But the Duke had seen his son's face do that particular color change before, always attached to a story that did not survive its second telling, and for the first time in longer than either of them could recall, the Duke did not simply nod along. He said nothing more on the matter. But he did not say Giles was right either, and in a house run on the careful management of appearances, a father's silence was its own small verdict. The first crack, quiet as it was, in the version of events Giles had built for himself. That afternoon, during the final rehearsal for the feast's opening ceremony, the presentation of the regimental colors, a small honor assigned to whichever footman Eulalie judged most decorative for the occasion, the chosen young man, a handsome new hire named Corbett with excellent posture and very little else to recommend him, fumbled the folded flag during the practice march, and it slipped from his hands and struck the floor of the ballroom in front of the entire assembled household staff. Eulalie's face went the color of the tablecloth linen. A gasp ran down the line of servants like a current through water, and nobody quite dared laugh, though several plainly wanted to. "Unacceptable," Eulalie said, in a voice gone thin with fury. Find someone else. Anyone. I do not care who. That flag does not touch this floor again. The steward, flustered, promised a replacement would be found before evening, and spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of mild panic, running through every footman on the estate, and finding each one either too clumsy, too short, or already assigned another duty for the night. Nobody in that ballroom yet knew who would carry the colors instead. But somewhere, in the machinery of the day, a decision was already turning that would put those colors into the one pair of hands in the entire household least expected to hold them. The evening of the feast arrived the way such evenings always do in stories like this one, too fast for the guilty and not fast enough for the wronged. Lockwood Hall blazed with candlelight. Motor cars crested the drive one after another, family crests gleaming on brass headlamps, gravel crunching under polished wheels. Inside, the great ballroom had been transformed. Long tables dressed in white linen, silver polished to mirror brightness, brass instruments tuning themselves in the gallery, and every chair in the county's finest families filled with men wearing medals for engagements they had commanded from a comfortable distance, and women wearing jewels that could have fed the servants' hall for a decade. At the head of the room sat General Sir Augustus Blythe, 55 years old, his chest heavy with decorations earned across 3 campaigns, his face lined with the particular weariness of a man who has spent 7 years searching for something he cannot name and has begun to fear he never will. Eulalie Lockwood moved through the room like a conductor through her own orchestra, accepting compliments on the flowers, the silver, the sheer scale of the evening, glowing under attention the way she always did when a room existed entirely to admire her arrangements. The county newspaper's photographer had already taken 3 plates of her, standing beside the head table, and she had arranged herself for each one with the practiced ease of a woman who had rehearsed the pose in a looking-glass. Down in the stable yard, in the cold autumn dark beyond the reach of the ballroom's light, Elias Gunn stood at the horses' heads, keeping the carriage teams steady against the swell of music and laughter rolling out through the tall windows. It was, as always, the post he had been given, close enough to be useful, far enough to be unseen. Torchlight threw long shadows across the cobbles. Somewhere overhead, a ring of stable keys hung silent on their hook, still, the way they only went still on the quietest nights. Inside, the toasts began. Colonel after colonel rose to praise General Blythe's gallantry, his command at the ridge, his steadiness under fire, his devotion to the men beneath him. Every word true, and none of them the whole truth, because not one man in that glittering room had been on that hillside, and not one of them knew the name of the man who had actually carried their guest of honor out of it. When it came his turn to rise and answer the toasts, General Blythe stood slowly, glass in hand, and began the reply he had given, in one form or another, at a dozen dinners across 7 years, thanking the county for its welcome, thanking the regiment for its sacrifice, thanking a war that had cost more than any toast could ever repay. He got as far as, "I owe my life to men whose names." And then he stopped. He was facing the tall windows at the side of the ballroom, windows thrown open against the heat of so many bodies and so many candles, and through them, lit by torchlight in the yard below, he saw a man standing at the heads of 4 gray horses, one hand pressed flat against the lead animal's neck, breathing slow, and even to hold it steady against the noise. And even at that distance, even through glass and torchlight and 7 years, the general saw the scar running from ear to collar exactly as he had seen it once before, lit orange by burning grass on a hillside 8,000 miles away. The glass slipped from General Blythe's fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a shot. Conversation died mid-sentence at every table. 200 faces turned toward the head of the room, expecting to see a man taken ill or overcome by emotion or struck by some sudden grief. And instead, they saw a decorated general already moving, already walking, faster with every step toward the tall doors at the side of the hall. General Blythe, are you unwell?" He did not answer. He did not slow. He crossed that ballroom the way he had once crossed open ground under fire, with a singleness of purpose that made every guest in his path simply step aside. Metals catching candlelight as he passed, chairs scraping back, a woman's fan clattering unnoticed to the floor, and behind him, because a county full of curious people cannot resist a mystery unfolding, in front of their eyes, the entire gathering began to move. First a trickle, then a current, then nearly the whole feast, gowns and medals and polished shoes, spilling out through the doors and down the front steps into the torchlit dark of the stable yard. Elias heard the doors bang open behind him and felt the horses startle at the sudden crowd noise. He turned, one hand still pressed to the lead mare's neck, steadying her with the other, and found himself facing the entire county of Derbyshire, pouring down the front steps of Lockwood Hall in evening dress. And at the front of them, alone, walking faster than a man his age should walk, General Sir Augustus Blythe. The general stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that torchlight caught every detail. He studied the scar the way a man studies a signature he has waited 7 years to see again, from the lobe of the ear, along the jaw, down into the collar, and something in his weathered face came utterly undone. "Turn your head," the general said, very quietly. "Toward the torch, please." Elias, bewildered, obeyed, and in that light, orange, flickering, close enough to feel the heat. The 7 years fell away from General Augustus Blythe all at once, and he was a young colonel again, choking on smoke, being carried the last 100 yards on the shoulders of a man who would not give his name. The general stepped back, his spine straightened. His heels came together with a crack that echoed off the stone walls of the yard, and General Sir Augustus Blythe, hero of Spion Kop, decorated 3 times over, guest of honor at the grandest feast Derbyshire had thrown in a generation, raised his hand in a full parade salute, and held it, to a scarred coachman standing at the head of 2 hired carriage horses in a stable yard, in front of every titled family in the county. The entire crowd on the steps went silent. Not a murmur, not a breath. 200 people frozen mid-step, watching a decorated general salute a servant, and not one of them understanding why, except that whatever they were witnessing was too enormous to interrupt. Somewhere near the back, a champagne cork popped absurdly into that silence, and nobody so much as turned their head toward the sound. Duchess Eulalie stood near the front of that frozen crowd, one gloved hand at her throat, her face draining of every drop of color it had held moments before under the ballroom's candlelight. The general held the salute a long moment. Then he lowered his hand and turned to face the crowd on the steps, and his voice, when it came, carried the way a parade ground voice carries, flat and enormous and impossible to interrupt. "Sergeant Elias Gunn," he said. "Spion Kop, 1900. He went back into that fire 3 times. I was the 3rd man he carried out." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman gasped, and the gasp ran backward through the gathering like a current down a wire, mouth to mouth, until it reached the very back of the group still crowding out through the ballroom doors. A glass somewhere shattered against stone. Nobody bent to sweep it. "For 7 years," the general went on, "the army has held a medal gazetted for an act of gallantry it could not attach to a name. For 7 years I have looked at every scarred face I passed, hoping it was his. I did not think I would find him serving soup at a party held in my own honor." He looked directly at Eulalie. He did not raise his voice further. He did not need to. "I am told," he said, "that this face spoils soup." The words landed in that yard like a blow. Eulalie's mouth opened and produced no sound at all. "It carried 4 men out of a fire that killed better men than any of us standing here tonight," the general said. "Look at it properly, all of you, every one of you. Look at the face you have been hiding in your stables for 6 years. Nobody moved. Nobody dared." "Bring him in," the general said, to no one and to everyone. He will sit at my right hand tonight in the coat he is wearing, and any man in that hall who objects may say so to me directly. Not one person objected. General Blythe took Elias by the arm, not as an escort takes a servant, but as one soldier takes another, and walked him up the front steps of Lockwood Hall, through the parting crowd, past faces that had ranked him lowest of every servant in the house for 6 straight years, and into the blazing ballroom, and sat him at the head table in his coachman's coat, with the burn scar in full view of every candle in the room. The band, uncertain what else to do, began to play again, and nobody listened to a note of it. Duchess Eulalie followed inside on legs that did not entirely feel like her own, and took her seat because there was nowhere else in that room she could stand and still be looked at with anything less than open astonishment. The photographer, sensing correctly that his 3 earlier plates of the Duchess would never see print, now quietly reloaded his camera and turned it toward the head table instead. Giles Lockwood, seated further down the table in his spotless dress uniform, had gone the color of ash. He had spent 6 years mocking a man he now understood, in front of the entire county, to be the single most decorated act of courage anyone in that hall had ever personally witnessed the proof of. General Blythe was not finished. He rose again, glass refilled, and turned first to Elias. "Sergeant, I owe you a debt no dinner can repay, but I intend to begin tonight." Then to the room, his eyes settling, deliberately, unhurriedly, on the young lieutenant in the spotless uniform 3 seats down. "Lieutenant Lockwood," the general said, "I understand you wear the colors of the yeomanry with some pride. Perhaps you would do us the honor of telling the table which engagements your medals commemorate. I confess I do not recognize the ribbons." The silence that followed was its own answer. Giles's medals were parade decorations, service ribbons, marks of attendance rather than gallantry, and every officer at that table knew the difference at a glance. Giles opened his mouth twice and closed it twice, and said nothing at all, and the silence stretched long enough that it became, all by itself, the most complete humiliation the young man had ever suffered in his short and comfortable life. Somewhere down the table, Pemberton studied his own plate with sudden and total fascination, and Vane found something urgent to whisper to the woman beside him rather than meet his friend's eye. The general did not press further. He did not need to. He turned back to the room. "Captain Whitfield," he said, and his aide rose from a side table. "The box, if you please." Whitfield produced a small case, worn at the corners from 7 years of travel, and set it in front of the general, who opened it himself. Inside lay a medal that had waited 7 years for a name to be pinned beside it. "This decoration was gazetted the week after Spy on Cop," the general said, "for an act of extraordinary gallantry performed by a sergeant whose name the regiment could never confirm. I have carried it to every posting I have held since, in the hope of one day finding the man it belongs to." He lifted it from its case. Candlelight caught the ribbon, and somewhere down the table a woman pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. "I have found him," he said, "serving as a coachman in a county that could not be bothered to ask him a single question about the scar on his neck." He pinned it, there at the table, in front of 200 witnesses, to the lapel of a coachman's plain wool coat, and the room that had spent 6 years pretending Elias Gunn's face did not exist rose to its feet, every last one of them, in an ovation that shook the candle flames along both long tables and rattled the tall windows in their frames. Elias sat through it with his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on the tablecloth, and only when the applause finally began to fade did he manage to speak quietly to the man beside him. "There were others," he said, "at the fire, men I didn't reach. I've never been able to make the number come out even. 4 saved doesn't settle what I owe the ones I couldn't get to." General Blythe set down his own glass and looked at him for a long moment. "I have the same list, Sergeant," he said. "Mine is longer than yours. Every year it grows a little, whether I'm at war or not. We carry it. We do not let it carry us. Elias said nothing, but something in his shoulders, some old permanent weight, shifted, just slightly, for the first time in 7 years. The days that followed Lockwood Hall's victory feast rearranged the household in ways no one there would have predicted a week earlier. Duke Ferdinand, for the first time in memory, made a decision without waiting to see what it would cost him. He informed Giles, in a conversation the whole staff heard about within the hour, that the lieutenant would be spending the coming season attached to a working regiment rather than a parade ground, so that he might learn, the Duke said, precisely what those ribbons are meant to represent. Giles did not argue. There was, for once, nothing left to say. Eulalie never again lined the staff up for inspection by countenance. She did not apologize. Women like Eulalie rarely learned to, but the ranking quietly disappeared from Lockwood Hall's calendar and was never revived, and when new staff were hired in the seasons that followed, no one thought to mention how they looked standing in a doorway. The county newspaper ran the photographer's plate of the head table on its front page, General Blythe's hand resting on a coachman's shoulder, and Eulalie kept a copy of that paper in a drawer for years afterward, though she never once showed it to a guest. Elias Gunn was offered, within the week, a commission befitting a decorated sergeant, a position in the regiment, an income that would have let him leave Lockwood Hall and its stables forever. He turned it down. He kept the coachman's post, by choice, not obligation, and he kept the medal in a drawer in his room above the tack shed rather than pinned to his coat, because he had never done it for the medal and did not intend to start wearing it for one now. But he no longer hid the scar. He no longer answered "an accident, sir," when a stranger asked. He told the truth, plainly, in the same 6 words every time, and let people make of it what they would. He began training the stable boys himself, not just in harness and hoof and rein, but in the low, even breathing that calmed a frightened animal, the same breathing that had once walked him through fire. Tam was his first and best student, and within the year there was not a servant at Lockwood Hall, high or low, who was ranked by anything but the work of their hands. Some nights, from the tack room window, Elias could still see torchlight flickering across the stable yard, and some nights it still put him back on that hillside for a moment, among the smoke and the men he did not reach. But it did not own him the way it once had. He had learned, at last, to carry the list without letting it carry him. General Blythe wrote to him twice a year after that, always the same short line at the top of the letter, before any other news. "The list is still mine to carry too, Sergeant, and I am carrying it." Elias kept every one of those letters folded in the same drawer as the medal, and read them again on the nights the torchlight took him back to the smoke. The room above the tack shed changed too, in small ways nobody had ordered and everybody noticed. A second lamp appeared on the windowsill, so the light spilled further across the yard on winter evenings. A row of hooks went up along one wall, and by spring they held 4 sets of small harness, cut down and mended for boys not yet grown into a man's tack, because Tam had brought 2 younger cousins from the village to learn the work, and Elias had never once turned a willing pair of hands away. Purdy took to sitting in that doorway most evenings now, pipe lit, listening to Elias talk the newest boys through the business of calming a nervous colt, and he would say to anyone who asked that he had worked 30 years in that yard and never once heard it as quiet or as easy as it had become since the night a general saluted a coachman in front of the whole county. Tam, for his part, told the story of that night to every stable boy who came after him, word for word, embellished a little further each year, until the youngest of them could not say for certain how much of it was true and how much was legend, except that every one of them, without needing to be told twice, learned to look a man in the face before they judged him by it. Scars are receipts. Some men paid for what the rest of us keep, and the least we owe them is to look at the bill properly, instead of asking it to stay out of sight until the soup is served. Scars are receipts. Some men paid for what the rest of us keep, and the least we owe them is to look at the bill properly, instead of asking it to stay out of sight until the soup is served. So we ask you tonight. Elias Gunn hid a hero's medal for 7 years, out of grief for the men he could not save. Was that humility we should honor, or a truth the fallen deserved to have told sooner? Tell us which side you stand on. This is Dukes and Duchesses, where every story is told the way it deserves to be told. Subscribe now, share this with someone today, and tell us in the comments which moment hit you the hardest. We will see you for the next story. It is already waiting.